China has been working, and not by itself, in conjunction with other countries, the BRICS countries, countries that are partners in the Belt and Road Initiative. Um, they have been working for years now to create alternative institutions, alternative systems for the settlement of international transactions, moving away from the dominance of the U.S. dollar, creating infrastructure and other things that allow some of the chokeholds that the United States wants to try to assert, to no longer be as effective. And what we're seeing here, I think, is to some extent kind of a payoff of that work, of the work that they've been doing, of creating this, getting countries out from under the thumb of the United States.
We're going to be talking about the war on Iran, but through the lens of what it means, where China's at on this. Because since Trump's memorandum of understanding with Iran collapsed this month, as we covered on Tuesday, Washington has rolled out what it's calling Operation Economic Outcast. Know who the hell comes up with these names? Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, that's his self-described economic D-Day against Iran. It's supposed to be this unprecedented campaign to cut off every remaining financial lifeline the country has left. The message from the White House was that any nation that keeps doing business with Iran will face the full reach of American power. Now, China's foreign ministry has publicly rejected Washington's demands and called the sanctions illegal and unilateral. And China had already told its own companies to keep buying Iranian oil, regardless of what the U.S. threatens. China buys somewhere between 80 to 90% of Iran's sanctioned crude exports. So it's by far Iran's most important trading partner. And without that market, Iran's economy would be in a far worse position than it already is. When Washington's D-Day measures landed, they hit a Chinese-owned tanker and a Hong Kong shipping firm, but conspicuously avoided touching major Chinese banks. Xi Jinping is due at the White House next month, and it seems nobody in Washington wants to blow up the trade truce over the war with Iran. So, is Operation Economic Outcast dead on arrival if they can't get China on board? What does it mean that one country actually capable of telling Washington no is doing exactly that? And is China's resistance of this pressure campaign purely out of self-interest? Or is there a bigger, more strategic calculation at play, one where Beijing sees today's siege on Iran as a rehearsal for tomorrow's potential U.S. siege on China? To help us unpack all of this, we're joined by Dr. Ken Hammond, professor of East Asian and Global History at New Mexico State University. Ken, welcome to BT Live. It's such an honor to have you on.
Always glad to be here.
Well, there's so much we want to get into here. And as I just said in the intro, Washington billed Operation Economic Outcast as its D-Day moment on Iran. Most of the world, is either going to comply if they're too weak to say no with the sanctions demands like that, or will do quiet workarounds without saying it so loud. But China did something a bit different here. Its Commerce Ministry invoked a domestic law explicitly built to shield Chinese companies from foreign sanctions it considers illegitimate. And its Foreign Ministry has said so on the record. So China is explicitly saying no, at least for now. So how significant is it that China is the one country willing to say no to Washington's face on this? And what does Beijing actually risk by doing that? And I guess on top of that, why is it willing to take that risk when so many others are not?
Yeah, well, that gets right to the heart of the matter. And I think that one way to understand China's position right now and why China, can stand up to the United States, why China can say, no, we're not doing this, why China can construct its legal system to shield its own corporations, its own businesses that want to be trading with Iran. We have to see this in a larger framework, within a larger framework, because, yeah, China buys a lot of oil from Iran. It is, as you mentioned, maybe 80% or more of Iran's sanctioned exports of oil are going to China. But actually, in terms of China's overall supply of petroleum products, Iran's exports are only about 4 or 5%. So it's an interesting balance there. The threat of some bad impact on China is actually fairly minimal, and they're very conscious of that. They've been stockpiling, they have diversified their sourcing, so there's a number of things, steps they've taken specifically around this question of oil. But more importantly, China has been working, and not by itself, in conjunction with other countries, the BRICS countries, countries that are partners in the Belt and Road Initiative. Um, they have been working for years now to create alternative institutions, alternative systems for the settlement of international transactions, moving away from the dominance of the U.S. dollar, creating infrastructure and other things that allow some of the chokeholds that the United States wants to try to assert, to no longer be as effective. And what we're seeing here, I think, is to some extent kind of a payoff of that work, of the work that they've been doing, of creating this, getting countries out from under the thumb of the United States. That's certainly by no means a done deal. There's still a tremendous amount of work to be done. The power of the United States, economically, even as you say, a lot of countries are going to not be in a position right now to defy the United States on this. But for China to do this, for China to be able to say, nope, sorry, we hear what you're saying, but we're not going to comply with that. That sends a message too, right? And I think that other countries will maybe move a little closer to China in terms of their economic activities. Maybe we'll want to participate a little more in, the renminbi settlement system. India, of course, and Russia have been trading back and forth in rupees and rubles. Get out from under the dollar. Get out from under this mechanism of domination. Because if fine, Bessent wants to talk about an economic D-Day, that's dependent upon the ability of the United States to impose these sanctions. If you're not trading in dollars, you're not routing your transactions through American-dominated institutions, you're going to be much less vulnerable to that. And that's the long-term work that China has been embarked upon. Again, as I say, in partnership with many other countries, but with China obviously as kind of the center of gravity of this process. So I think the present moment, of course, there's a very short-term, minimal mental horizon prevalent in Washington these days. They think that you just snap your fingers or do whatever, and things are going to happen instantaneously. And they have no sense of historical development, let alone what's actually out there in terms of reality. But the Chinese are not. The Chinese is not. It's not like that over there. The party and the planners in China have been thinking very carefully about their position in the world, and I think we're seeing here some of the fruit of those efforts.
I mean, it is really remarkable to see some of the statements that were made by countries like China and other BRICS countries against sanctions being really kind of put into practice, because they no longer are just kind of rhetoric, but actually actually taking shape. And so, getting to some of what you said, China has its own reasons to want a strong relationship with Iran, like energy security, although you note that Iran's oil exports make up a small amount of what China consumes and imports in terms of oil. Iran is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's a strategic partner that is not aligned with Washington. But beyond these economic cooperation agreements that China and Iran have, is there an element of China looking at this Iran squeeze and thinking, if Washington gets away with using sanctions, financial exclusion, and secondary threats to try and strangle Iran's economy, that same toolkit gets refined and pointed at us next? In other ways, does Beijing see Iran's predicament as a preview of its own? And is that part of why it's drawing this line now rather than later?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that again, China has been aware for many years, and sort of most recently since about 2011, with the whole pivot to Asia by the Obama administration, that the United States continues to have a long-term objective of disrupting China's development, of restricting its ability to assume the kind of place in the world that a country of its size and its rapidly growing economy obviously is going to come to occupy. I think that the United States is desperate to hang on to its power, its privileges, the perks that its ruling elites have enjoyed for so long, and they see China as the greatest threat to that. Yeah, I think that a lot of what the Americans have been trying to do with Iran, and again in this unrealistic sense of that they can just go drop a lot of bombs and Iran would be somehow neutralized or done away with or have regime change or something like that. Nonetheless, that's the game. That's the game plan. That's the playbook that the Americans are working with, and so China understands that. China can see that. They understand that if that were to have worked in Iran, which clearly it hasn't, the idea of maybe imposing some kind of coastal blockade on China, trying to disrupt China's international trade, trying to intervene. I mean, I don't think the United States is quite, even the Trump administration is quite foolish enough to consider just kind of unprovoked bombing campaigns against China. But even if they did try something like that, China's in a position much stronger than than it has ever been, for the last 200 years, and they're confident of that. So yeah, they're looking at what's happening in Iran. They know the Americans would love to be coming for them next. But I think that the resistance of Iran, the success that Iran has had in destroying American military and intelligence infrastructure around the Gulf, I think that has been remarkable. Of course, that's not a story that you're going to hear on mainstream media here in the United States. But we know that is, they've done billions of dollars worth of damage, and the American military looks pretty shabby, pretty humiliated in the face of this experience with Iran, and Iran and China have a long relationship, a long partnership in not just in economic terms, but in trying to build these alternative institutions, Belt and Road Initiative, other things like that. So I think that China respects, understands American military power, and they understand the recklessness and the irresponsibility of the current administration, but also the overall long-term commitment of American political elites on both ends of the bourgeois political spectrum to try to disrupt China's development, try to keep China from emerging as part of a new multi-centric order. I think the Chinese are increasingly confident that they're capable of dealing with whatever the United States tries to toss at them, and this posture of defiance that they are assuming right now is a clear expression of that. They don't need to bend the knee to the United States anymore, and I think it's going to be a very, very interesting visit when Xi Jinping comes next month. All he has to do is lean across the table and say two words: rare earths. And what are they going to do? So I think that yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say it's interesting because there's all these hawks in Congress, these China hawks, who are so upset that Chinese banks were not sanctioned. And there's a reason Chinese banks weren't sanctioned. At least that's what the Western media is saying. It's because of the fact that there's this meeting next month that you're talking about, and it's like this very fragile sort of tariff truth that Trump's dealing with, and so he can't sanction the Chinese banks. But then there's all these members of Congress who are so upset about that because they understand that there's really no teeth to these demands about Iran, respecting U.S. sanctions on Iran if you're not going to sanction the banks. But it does show China's much stronger position than it would have had, a few decades ago. But it's not just with the, economics that we're talking about. The support China's given Iran throughout this war has gone beyond that. Western reporting and, U.S. government reports themselves are always whining about the fact that, they've tied these Chinese made man pads, which are these shoulder fired anti-air missiles, to Iran's arsenal, with one US F-15 loss reportedly linked to one, alongside a Chinese spy satellite, reportedly, according to them, used to monitor US bases across the Gulf. Chip making equipment, Chinese chip making equipment allegedly flowing to Iran's military industrial sector, and then these shipments of chemical precursors used in solid rocket fuel. That's on top of China shielding Iran's oil trade and blocking consensus at the UN Security Council when it so chooses to. So I'm just curious if you could talk a bit about the significance of China's, the actual scope of what China has done for Iran here, militarily and diplomatically, because of course that goes beyond the economics of it. And why China has been willing to go that far when it insists in public that it's not taking sides.
Yeah, well, obviously China is not going to come out with like direct military intervention. I mean, their overall foreign policy orientation, their position in international affairs is that they don't go outside basically their own frontiers. They're working on building a socialist future for their people, and that's their top priority. That is, in a sense, as we might say, the primary contradiction that they're trying to address. But short of overt military assistance or intervention, I think that China's engaged in a fairly full spectrum relationship with Iran. I think that the intelligence assistance that they've been able to provide through satellites and other resources has been significant. I think the items that you just mentioned, all of those reflect, in a sense, the subtleties that China has at its disposal, as well as the more blatant economic leverage that they may be able to exercise. And I think that I don't know. China has worked so hard to develop these relationships, not just with Iran, but with Central Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, African countries, Latin American countries, in ways that are just so different from the United States. They're not coming in and telling people what to do and ordering people around, but they're there providing assistance. And kind of it's ironic for Americans to talk about this kind of stuff, but the idea that they come and they really do they want to help, and there's a world of activity that goes on behind the scenes, and we all understand that. And certainly in the United States, every time the United States gets publicly up in a righteous posture about, the Chinese are sneaking around and doing this stuff. Well, the United States has run clandestine operations in more countries than I can count, and the suggestion that somehow, if China makes information from, let's say, one of its satellites available,
Did we lose
something wrong with that? Yeah, I just
Sorry,
think
we
that
lost your audio for you. Your audio slipped for a second, but now it's back.
Nope.
We got worried.
So
We thought
sorry.
maybe you were
Okay.
being silent.
Oh, heavens forbid. No, I just think that the hypocrisy of American politicians is often laughable.
Of course. And Ken, before we let you go, while I think a lot of people are rightfully, applauding China for taking this strong stand against the US and in some ways kind of showing solidarity um, to Iran, there has been real criticism, including people who again are sympathetic to Iran and the Palestinian cause, that China's support isn't enough and that this fits a pattern. China has kept trading and maintaining ties with Israel throughout the Gaza genocide, and its support for Cuba against the US blockade has been rhetorical. There, of course, have been very important shipments of solar panels, but it really hasn't used all of the economic leverage that it has to actually break the siege that Cuba is facing right now. As Washington gets more openly violent across the board, is China's caution here principled restraint, or is a pattern of doing the minimum that protects its own interests without seriously confronting U.S. power?
Yeah, that's obviously a delicate or difficult set of questions, and I personally feel that I would like to see China doing considerably more than they have, particularly for the Palestinian people. I mean, China, convened that meeting where they brought the various Palestinian organizations together and worked out an agreement. They brokered the Saudi-Iranian, I won't say reconciliation, but agreement. So they've done good things, but I would like to see them do more. I'd like to see them take a more, how shall we say, just a stronger stance with their trade relations with Israel. I would like to see them do more to support Cuba and Venezuela. But, this has been China's position for many, many years of, uh, not, I mean, they talk about it sometimes as not interfering in the internal affairs of other countries. And by that generally means direct intervention. But I think that they follow a very cautious path. And it's one that, I agree. I would like to see them do more. I would like to see them have more than. I mean, they have very clear, very strong positions. I'd like to see that backed up a little more by direct, not military intervention or anything, but by more pressure on the bad guys. And I understand and I don't disagree entirely with people that express that criticism.
No, for sure. And
Well,
I think,
oh, sorry. Go ahead, Zoe.
no, it's
Complete
just,
the
these are important debates to have and discussions, because again, as we're entering this phase of extremely violent US imperialism, it will only, I think these questions and debates will come up more and more often. But
No, absolutely. Well, Ken Hammond, it is always a pleasure to have you on. We really appreciate you, Professor of East Asian and Global History at New Mexico State University. We look forward to continuing this discussion very, very soon. Thanks for coming
Well,
on.
I'm happy to come back anytime.